Is Dan Bilzerian inadvertently aiding the Zionists? It's a big claim, but in a recent interview with Piers Morgan, he claimed that the greatest threat to the world today is Jewish supremacy.
I believe that Jewish supremacy is the greatest threat to America, and I think it's the greatest threat to the world today. I truly believe that. Well, I think most of the problems today is caused by Jewish supremacy. I believe that.
Does that statement actually aid Zionism while also absolving the West of its crimes because it's all the fault of the Jews?
Well, when you have a religion that promotes supremacy, when you have a religion that says that you are better than other people, and when you have a religion that says it's okay to steal from other people as long as they're not Jewish, when you have a religion that says it's okay to rape people that aren't Jewish, when you have a religion that talks about having sex with, kids that are under 3 years old, when you have a religion that promotes these things and promotes supremacy, I think you're going to have problems. And you see that in Israel. Israel is a manifestation of that religion. And I think that religion is, it's terrible.
Let me begin by saying that such a statement is both dangerous and misinformed. Blaming the world's problems on Jews or claiming that Jewish supremacy is the primary global threat is an oversimplification that distracts from the real issues. However, Dan was correct in highlighting the double standards when it comes to criticisms of different groups, particularly Islam and Muslims.
You can say whatever you want against Muslims. You can be, super anti-Muslim. You can talk about them and nobody cares. But if you say anything about Jewish people, you get canceled. They, look what they did to Kanye. So why are they such a protected class? Let me ask you that.
You can say the most egregious things about Islam and Muslims and face no issues whatsoever. For instance, imagine if someone were to publicly state we need to make life harder for Jews in Europe and make it less attractive for them to live there. This would be rightly condemned as anti-Jewish, yet Douglas Murray, who Piers Morgan has featured on his show and even invited him to be a guest host, said something eerily similar about Muslims. He said conditions for Muslims in Europe must be made harder across the board. Not only did Douglas Murray make this statement, but he also referred to Islam as an opportunist infection, and he also advocated for the demolition of mosques. Now imagine if someone said that about Judaism, Jews or synagogues. Would they be given a platform on mainstream media? Would a government official praise them? Yet Douglas Murray is frequently featured on Piers Morgan's show and was even commended by the UK's Home Secretary in Parliament last year. This double standard is clear, and Dan is right to call it out. Islam and Muslims are often unfairly targeted in ways that Jews and Judaism are not. However, pointing out hypocrisy doesn't justify Dan's claim that Jewish supremacy is the greatest threat in the world today. This narrative is not only false, but also is harmful for two critical reasons. Firstly, it justifies Zionist claims that criticisms against Israel and Zionism is not due to anger over the injustice and legitimate grievances perpetrated against Muslims and Palestinians, but it's fueled by hatred against Jews. So their criticisms, pro-Palestinian criticisms, is simply prejudice and hatred against the Jews under the cover of being anti-Zionist or anti-Israel. And thus you can never take what pro-Palestinian voices say as truthful, because they'll distort the facts, they'll cover the truth and lie just so they can express their hatred towards Jews. Secondly, it takes away the focus from the real issue, which is Western civilization and its ideology. That this civilization has not only birthed the problem of Zionism, but also other social and political issues, from colonialism to genocide and even the woke LGBTQI culture. You see, people like Candace Owens, Dan Bilzerian and other right-wing commentators perpetuate the myth that if it weren't for the Jews, the world would be at peace. They promote the false idea that Jews are the ones keeping Christians and Muslims apart. But this is pure nonsense. Fundamentally, blaming the Jews deflects the true problem, the ideology of the West, Western civilization itself. Look, it wasn't the Jews who colonized Americas, Africa or Australia. It wasn't Jews who carried out en masse transatlantic slave trade. It wasn't Jews that enacted a genocide against the indigenous populations of America and Australia. These atrocities were driven by Western European powers rooted in ideologies of superiority, exploitation and domination. If Jews or Judaism didn't exist, we'd still have seen the colonization and genocide perpetrated across the world and even in the Muslim world, all in the name of European enlightenment. As Churchill once said, "I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race has come in and taken their place." Churchill wasn't speaking as a Jew. He wasn't quoting the Talmud or the Torah. He wasn't even Jewish, but he represented the very ideas of the West. In fact, Churchill made this quote during the Peel Commission that looked into the partition plan of Palestine under British Mandate rule, where he described the Palestinians as dogs in a manger. In the early 20th century, with the rise of anti-Semitism across Europe because of its close association to communism and socialism, i.e. the Bolsheviks revolution, European states sought to remove their Jewish population. This is why Lord Balfour, from the Balfour Declaration, passed the Aliens Act in 1905 to prevent Jewish migration into Britain from Eastern Europe. But Britain also saw with Eastern Europeans a great opportunity in serving their colonial interest in the mass migration of European Jews into the heart of the Muslim world, particularly Palestine. As Lord Curzon stated in 1920 about promoting Jewish migration to Palestine, he stated, "For a distinct military and strategic objective, India." Similarly, Ronald Storr, the British governor of Jerusalem, also argued that mass migration of European Jews was also in Britain's favour because it would create a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism. See, at the time, Britain wanted to secure its trade routes from India across the Red Sea and through the Suez Canal to Britain and also to the rest of the world. Having a loyal European Jewish population that saw themselves aligned with the West, and Britain in particular, would help secure this trade route. And this is similar to today with America's plan to create an economic trade corridor between India across the Arab lands of UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, into Israeli ports, and then through the Suez Canal to supply the West with Indian goods. So in that sense, Israel and its existence has been perceived as an extension of colonial or neo-colonial rule in the region. Now, I have a video discussing whether Israel actually serves Western interests and that of America, but the perception, the arguments for Western support for Israel is that it ultimately serves Western interests, their neo-colonial interests within the Arab lands. The West's history of colonization and their desire to extend the hegemony across the Arab world created the very foundations for Zionism as we see it today.
It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region.
Zionism itself is not inherently Jewish. It is rooted in Western ideas of nation-state theory. This idea argued that a nation-state is determined by a specific ethnicity who share a common language, history and culture, and thus justifies them as being a state. Early Zionists, many of whom were atheists, argued that Jews were an ethnicity and that they fulfilled the concept of a nation state, even though they didn't have a physical state. This notion also aligned with European colonial ambitions, as I mentioned before, particularly with Britain, which saw Jewish migration of Palestine as a strategic tool. So when Zionist Jewish migration took place to Palestine, they simply adopted the same colonial playbook as European powers, displacing indigenous populations, changing demographics, and claiming moral justification for their actions and therefore for their state. They basically did the same thing Europeans did when they colonized America or Australia: mass migration, ethnically cleansing the land, including acts of genocide in order to change the demographics and then justify their existence to call it America or Australia or New Zealand. This is not about Judaism. This is about Western colonial interest underpinned by secular capitalist ideology. Dan's claim about Jewish supremacy only serves to distract from these realities. By focusing on the Jews as the problem, he misses the true issue: the systemic ideology of the West that justifies colonialism, neo-colonialism, and the idea of changing demographics to justify a particular nation state. People like Dan Bilzerian and others argue that woke culture and LGBTQI++ movements are Jewish inventions.
No, I believe that Jewish supremacy is the greatest threat to the world today. I look at what they're doing in the media. They're pushing this transgender nonsense. And they did it in Germany. The first transgender clinic was opened by a Jewish guy. And I don't like this perversion pushed on our children. I don't like the fact that 9-year-olds are reading about homosexual acts. I don't like that drag queens are reading them in schools. I don't like that Kamala Harris wants to pay for sex changes in prison so that men can turn into women and women can turn into men. And I don't like the fact that he's putting in, men into women's prisons, male rapists into women's prisons because they identify as women. I mean, it's just nonsense. I don't like, men beating up women in boxing and sports. I think it's all nonsense, and I think it's leading to a degradation of moral fiber. And if left unchecked, I think it's going to ruin the world.
But these movements are direct consequences of Western liberal secularism, which prioritizes individual freedom and gratification. The idea that everyone should be free to do whatever they want stems from Western philosophers like John Locke, Jeremy Bentham, or John Stuart Mills, not from the Torah or the Talmud. Transgender activists don't argue on the basis of, the Torah and the Talmud. They argue on the basis of liberal, secular, capitalist ideas that they have the right to their own pronouns. They have the right to become a woman or a man or whatever, and no state, religion, or authority can tell them otherwise. Similarly, if a Jew owns a pornographic website, it's not because of Judaism, it's because of Western capitalist values that prioritizes profit and individual freedom over collective morality. Individualism, freedoms, and the claim humans act for their self-interest to achieve gratification are the fundamental ideas that underpin the problems the right, so-called conservative right, sees with the world today. But instead of blaming liberal, secular, capitalist ideology that commoditizes everything, including sex, some on the right want to blame it on the Jews. But blaming the Jews for these societal shifts is like blaming the players without understanding the rules of the game. Ironically, narratives like Dan's reinforce Zionist propaganda. Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, wrote in his diaries, "The government of all countries scourged by anti-Semitism will be keenly interested in assisting us to obtain the sovereignty we want. The anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends." By perpetuating anti-Jewishness, figures like Dan inadvertently bolster Zionist claims that Jews need a homeland to protect themselves from persecution. This fear-mongering results in a number of things. Firstly, it encourages Jews to support Zionism out of fear of rising anti-Semitism. Zionists want to see Jews leave Europe for Palestine. They want to shore up support amongst Jews for the Zionist colonial entity in order to help change the demographics in order to favor the Jews and Zionists over the Palestinians. Secondly, it justifies Zionist colonialism as a response to anti-Semitism. It guilt trips the West into supporting Zionist entity. See, Zionists argue that Jews face an extreme existential threat to their own existence, and because of that, they have to undertake extreme responses to defend themselves from complete annihilation. Hence why they constantly juxtapose the Holocaust with regards to their actions, claiming it's a self-defense from facing a similar threat and similar fate that they faced in the Second World War. Thirdly, it frames Palestinian resistance as anti-Jewish hatred rather than opposition to occupation. Palestinians are not struggling for freedom under occupation. They aren't trying to get their land back from colonization, but rather they hate all Jews and want to see them annihilated. Inadvertently, this is what Dan does. By attempting to focus on the Jewishness of the conflict and by claiming that Jews are the real threat to the world, it plays into hands of the Zionists and even that of the West. You see, if the people begin seeing Zionism, the Palestinian occupation, or even the woke culture as a symptom of the Western liberal secular capitalist ideology, then people will begin to think about real alternatives to the current dominant ideology we see in the West today, i.e. secular liberal capitalist ideology. This then allows us to have a proper conversation about an alternative worldview. For instance, Jews lived for centuries under Islamic rule. There wasn't the crisis of masculinity, feminist movements, or debates about what a woman is, because Islam provides a comprehensive framework for life, how to view it, the correct way to view justice, morality, and governance that transcends the failures of Western liberalism and secular capitalism. Dan, if you see this, I invite you to engage in a discussion with me, inshallah, so we can address the real issues and work towards real solutions, God willing. And remember, there's no point focusing on the players when we should be really focusing on the game.